From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm of the library. Our center was created in 1977 when Daniel Borston was the Librarian of Congress, and Dan Borston felt the Library of Congress should do more to reach out to the general public to promote books and reading. And so the Center for the Book was his baby. We are also a public-private partnership. We raise private money for our programming, even though we are, of course, all Library of Congress employees. We've expanded through the years to not only include the library's first Young Readers Center, which is a programming place for kids 16 and under, as long as they are accompanied by an adult, which is in the Jefferson Building. And the Library of Congress Poetry and Literature program is now also part of the Center for the Book. I was just talking with our guest today a little bit about the National Book Festival, in which the Center for the Book also plays a major role. This year, the Book Festival will be in the old time, late September, which is how we started 15 years ago. This year's festival is going to be September 24th. And it is in the Washington Convention Center, which is a change for us. It originated under Laura Bush's auspices on the Mall, but now we're inside where we have air conditioning and comfortable bathrooms and a lot more programming space. And so we, after some initial reluctance, are happy to be in the Convention Center. The way this Books and Beyond program is our way of really pointing out that authors do research in libraries, and library places like the Library of Congress and other institutions are really important resources today for books and for new books. And so we always celebrate new books that have grown, at least in part, out of the collections of the Library of Congress, and such is the case today. Our speaker, Doug Waller, will speak for 30 minutes or so. We'll have a chance for questions, and we'll have a book signing outside that we need to start no later than 1 o'clock. All of these noontime author programs are filmed for the Library of Congress's and Center for the Book's website, as are the author programs for the National Book Festival. And we have several hundred of these broadcasts for the Book Festival and more than 300 talks from the Center for the Book. So I often mention that website as a wonderful resource for people interested in contemporary reading and literature, and to catch a snapshot of what's happening in the world of books and writing in America, really since 2001, the year of the first book festival. Because we're filmed and we'll have a question and answer period, I'd ask you to turn off all things electronic, and we look forward to a lively question and answer period. The way that the rules work, if you ask a question, you are giving us permission to, we hope, use your image and your comments later in the website that will be on our website. Our speaker today, Doug Waller, I think you probably know a little bit about him. He is really a wonderfully prolific writer and author. He is a former correspondent for Newsweek and Time magazines, where he covered the CIA, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and the Congress. But he very early on, we were chatting about this a bit, got interested in some of the subjects at which he was covering, and tried his hand at writing, and has been a successful historian and author for a number of years, and has several different fields of expertise. We were talking a little bit about his biography of General Billy Mitchell, World War I, where he used the resources of the Library of Congress quite a bit. He's, of course, best known for, I think, Wild Bill Donovan, the biography of the creator of the OSS, and that in turn has led him to the current book that he's going to be explaining to us. He also has worked on a variety of contemporary topics, and did tell me that the next book is going to be back to, and I'll let him tell you more about it, about the Civil War and intelligence during the American Civil War. So he's going to be back doing a lot of research at the Library of Congress. So I'm very pleased to present Doug Waller. Please help me welcome him for his talk about disciples. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. As he mentioned, I'm a regular customer here of the Library of Congress. I've camped out here for the last 2 books, well, actually, last 3 books now. So I've accumulated a lot of frequent flyer miles with this organization. After I published my biography of General William Wild Bill Donovan 4 years ago, I really had a tough time figuring out what to do next, because Donovan was really larger than life. A World War I hero who had been awarded the Medal of Honor, a Wall Street lawyer often mentioned as a presidential candidate, and the man Franklin Roosevelt picked to be his World War II spy master. In July 1941, by way of background, Donovan began what eventually became known as the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. He really started out this organization with just one guy, and that was himself. But over the course of the war, he assembled a force of more than 10,000 spies, saboteurs, commandos, propagandists, research analysts, many of them who came from the Library of Congress, and support personnel operating in stations all over the world. Wild Bill, he got that nickname leading troops in World War I, also was a controversial character. His agents revered him. His political enemies, and he had a lot of them in Washington, thought he was as big a threat to the United States as Adolf Hitler. So Donovan was going to be a hard act to follow. I finally settled on 4 subjects for my next book. These 4 were among the most controversial directors the CIA has ever had. Allen Dulles, who's down here at the bottom left, Richard Helms, who's over on the other, so this bottom right, bottom left there in the Navy uniform, Bill Colby up here in the corner, and Bill Casey. Allen Dulles, who was America's spy chief from 1953 to 61, launched the calamitous operation to land CIA-trained guerrillas, anti-Castro guerrillas in Cuba's Bay of Pigs. Richard Helms, who was CIA director from 1966 to 73, was convicted of lying to Congress over the CIA's effort to oust President Salvador Allende in Chile. Bill Colby, who was CIA director from 1973 to 76, would become a pariah among Langley's old hands for releasing to Congress what eventually became known as the Family Jewels Report on agency misdeeds in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. Bill Casey, who was CIA director from 1981 to 87, would nearly bring down the agency in Ronald Reagan's presidency from a scheme that secretly supplied Nicaragua's Contras with money raked off from the sale of arms to Iran for hostages in Beirut. This was the Iran-Contra scandal. But before these 4 men became their nation's spy master, they served under Donovan as operatives. Disciples is about the secret war they fought in the Office of Strategic Services, which became the precursor to today's CIA. These 4 men, I quickly found out, were characters as rich and complex and multifaceted as Donovan was. Allen Dulles looked like the headmaster of an upper-class English boarding school. He was usually dressed in a bow tie and tweed sport coat. His wiry gray hair was slightly mussed, his mustache always carefully trimmed, a pipe almost always clenched between his teeth. He had sparkling gray-blue eyes and a soft voice that invited people to pour their hearts out to him. Dulles' secretive nature, however, could be absolutely maddening. One of his agents once joked that if you asked him if it was raining outside, he'd laugh at you and he wouldn't tell you. Occasionally, it was a hearty laugh when he was truly amused at something, but more often than not, it was kind of a mirthless ho-ho-ho that he turned on when he was trying to ingratiate himself with a stranger or trying to deflect a question he didn't want to answer. That country gentleman routine also masked a fierce competitor, not willing to give up a single point on the tennis court, a back alley fighter, as one of his agents said of him, and a devious man who sized up people based solely on whether they were useful to him. Richard Helms was the consummate spy. He had a Mona Lisa-like smile. His hair was always slicked back neatly, and he had a cold personality. He didn't make friends easily, and even with the close friends he had, he rarely let his guard down with them. You can find plenty of stories in the CIA about its colorful characters, and they certainly had a lot of them. But no one could think of an anecdote about Helms. The consummate intelligence officer, he left no trail behind. People had to really think hard to come up with something to say about him because he made so little impression on them. At parties, he was a good dancer and a charming conversationalist, but he rarely drank more than one martini, so his head remained clear, and he was always the first one to leave the party so he'd be fresh at the office the next day. Or, if the gathering was at his house, he'd shoo out his guests when his bedtime neared. He smoked 2 packs of Chesterfields a day for most of his life. He was always immaculately tailored. His shoes were specially made for his small, high-arched feet at $700 a pair from Peel & Company in London. And he wore his belt with the buckle on the side instead of the front, which I thought was kind of odd. I don't know why. Bill Colby was once asked his definition of the perfect spy. He gave a pretty obvious answer: the one you don't see. Colby looked like a man who could be overlooked. He was slightly built. He had pale, dull eyes behind horn-rimmed glasses, and his hair was always parted neatly on the side. A private man, he was unfailingly polite with refined manners. He paid no attention to what he wore. He repaired plumbing and performed carpentry around the house on the weekends, but he had his guilty pleasures. He enjoyed a good bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, and on weekends he liked to drive his red Fiat sports car. And he appreciated beautiful women, although I could find no evidence that he ever acted on what he noticed. Classical Greek and Roman heroes intrigued Colby. One of his favorite characters was Lawrence of Arabia, and the movie where Peter O'Toole played T.H. Lawrence. Colby once told a family member that he'd never had a nightmare, and never even dreamed for that matter, which I thought was kind of odd. In the OSS and later the CIA, colleagues recalled Bill Colby as a dedicated soldier priest, but someone they really never knew. An informal poll was once circulated among nearly 60 CIA officers with 2 questions. Question number 1, if you were shipwrecked on a deserted island, a pleasant deserted island, with plenty of food and liquor, and every hope that a ship would come by to rescue you, who would you choose to be with? Allen Dulles won handily over Colby because he would be far better company while they were stranded. Second question, if you were stuck on a miserable deserted island with little food or hope of survival, and you badly wanted to escape, who would you choose to be with? Colby easily led Dulles because, as one of the respondents said, he would know how to build a boat to get him off the island, and he would build the boat big enough for 2. Bill Casey always made a bad first impression on others, even more so when he became middle-aged. He was tall and lumpy. He had a jowly face, thick lips, eyes bulging, and wisps of white hair on his bald head. He wore expensive suits that were always rumpled, his tie often stained with what he'd eaten for lunch, and he frequently mumbled when he spoke as if he had marbles stuffed in his mouth. His acquaintances usually ended up being either lifelong friends who worshipped him or skeptics who just couldn't escape the uneasy feeling that he was some kind of devious operator. But with Casey, looks were deceiving. That slovenly appearance masked a body who was constantly on the go. He once wrote a lengthy article on how to quickly consume a nonfiction book. Casey would read back to front, starting with the index and the source notes to pick out what he thought he needed to know, and then he'd bypass the rest. I would have hated to have him read one of my books that way. He had a photographic memory. He could retain passages almost verbatim from reports and journals articles that he seemed to be just flipping through. He had an insatiably curious mind. On family vacations in Europe, Casey's idea of fun was scooping up the timetable brochures at train stations, studying them in his hotel room overnight so he could recite from memory the itineraries the next morning. For all the differences among these four guys, I found a common thread that ran through Allen Dulles, Richard Helms, William Casey, and William Colby. They were all smart. And in fact, I think you call them intellectuals because they were voracious readers, they were thoughtful, and they were creatures of reason. But these weren't the ivory tower types who'd sit around for hours in doubtful introspection. These were strong, decisive, and supremely confident men of action. They were doers who believed that they could shape history rather than letting it control them. So what did they do in World War II? We'll start with Dulles. He was born in 1893 with a club foot. Surgeons repaired it, but the family always treated this as some kind of deep, dark secret. His father was a liberal Presbyterian minister. His mother came from diplomatic nobility. Allen's grandfather and an uncle on his mother's side were secretaries of state. Dulles was a precocious child. When he was 8 years old, he wrote a book on the Second Boer War. It was only 31 pages long. It had a lot of spelling mistakes, but his grandfather, the Secretary of State, published 700 copies of it, and he got a good review in the Washington Post. He went to Princeton, played around as much as he studied until his senior year. Then he finally buckled down. In 1916, he joined the State Department, and during World War II, he was stationed at the American Legation in Bern, Switzerland. By default, he became the station's, the legation's intelligence officer. There just wasn't anybody else around for the job. And neutral Switzerland was really a spy haven at that time for all the warring powers. Dulles basically taught himself how to be a spy, and he learned some hard lessons along the way. Late one afternoon, a man with a thick Russian accent phoned the legation and insisted on talking with an American diplomat. Dulles was late to a tennis date, so he told the man to come back the next morning when the legation opened, and he hung up. Turned out, he later found out that the Russian was Vladimir Lenin, who was on his way to Russia, headed back to his homeland the next morning. Dulles would tell that anecdote time and again to new CIA recruits who came to Langley. Never turned down a meeting, even with the shadiest of characters. He earned a law degree, left the State Department in 1926, and joined Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most powerful law firms in the world at that time. And by 1930, Allen was having numerous extramarital affairs, which his wife Clover, of course, didn't much appreciate. In the months before Pearl Harbor, Dulles had picked up rumors that Roosevelt had made Donovan chief of some nefarious spy group with secret funds that the White House controlled. Dulles knew Donovan. He enjoyed beating him on the tennis court, but he decided to keep his distance from Donovan's group to see what else might be open to him if the United States joined the war. After Pearl Harbor, Dulles decided to join the OSS. Already wealthy from his law practice, he took the job at no salary. His first job was organizing a major intelligence outpost in New York City to hatch covert operations against Germany. Turns out that New York was a good spot for recruiting foreign spies. The city was filled with immigrants, deposed royalty, European expats, many of them shady characters dreaming up all kinds of schemes in their Manhattan salons for infiltrating guerrillas into Nazi Germany. Dulles and Donovan weren't particularly bothered that most of these would-be emigre spies turned out to be a waste of their time. New York became a laboratory for Dulles' experiments in intelligence gathering. So, for example, he organized a project to counterfeit enemy currency there. He bought clothes from European refugees his men interviewed, so the OSS agents infiltrating into enemy territory could wear the garments to blend in. He even started a secret unit to tap into the records that American insurance companies held on their Axis business clients before the war. Now, why would he be interested in insurance files for the OSS? Well, those files often contain the blueprints of buildings being insured. Allied air forces found those blueprints particularly helpful when they were trying to decide how the building should be bombed. In November 1942, just after the Allies' torch invasion of North Africa, Dulles slipped into Switzerland with orders from Donovan to penetrate Nazi Germany. In Bern, he set up what amounted to a mini CIA, running espionage operations, funding guerrilla missions in occupied France and Italy, and inundating Washington with foreign policy advice on how to deal with the Axis. Most of it Washington ignored. For his staff, Dulles recruited a handful of Americans living in Switzerland. One of them was Mary Bancroft, an American socialite there who ended up being Dulles's mistress. He had scores of informants on his payroll. Many of them turned out to be professional snitches who often passed the same secrets to the Germans in the morning, to the British in the afternoon, and to Dulles in the evening. But Dulles met them all. He didn't want to repeat the same mistake he made with Vladimir Lenin. And he had some prized sources. He recruited, for example, Fritz Colby, a short, bald German Foreign Office diplomat with beady eyes and big ears, who delivered to him some 1,600 classified Nazi political, military, and intelligence cables. Colby first had the documents strapped around his leg when he came to Berlin. Then Dulles gave him a miniature camera to photograph them and bring them to him in a watch case. Another valuable source was Hans Baron Gisevius, who was this stern Abwehr major who had come to detest Adolf Hitler. On his visits to Bern, Gisevius would brief Dulles on the dissidents remaining in Nazi Germany who were laying plans to assassinate Adolf Hitler in what became known as the Valkyrie plot, which failed on July 20th, 1944. You remember Tom Cruise did a movie on Valkyrie. Dulles gave Gisevius, who was a hulk of a man, he was over 6 feet tall, just huge, the code name Tiny. Now, let's turn to Bill Casey. His birth in 1913 set a family record his mother could have done without. He arrived weighing a staggering 14 pounds. Yeah, I know, everybody always groans when I say that. The son of a New York Tammany Hall bureaucrat, Casey was a bright child, but he drove the nuns at Catholic school nuts because he seemed intent on educating himself the way he saw fit. He went to Fordham University, the first in his family to go to college. Then he went to Catholic University of America here in Washington to be a social worker. But he quickly became disenchanted with that calling after several months as a New York social worker. He thought welfare money was being wasted, and FDR was a bleeding heart liberal. Casey earned a law degree going to night school, and by the time Hitler invaded Poland, he was working as an analyst for the Research Institute of America, a think tank that advised businessmen on how to land contracts with the New Deal. After the United States entered the war, Casey, who soon was married with a baby girl, wanted in on the action. He talked the Navy into making him a lieutenant junior grade. It took some talking and convincing, however. The Navy at first didn't think he was officer material, but they ended up finding a place for him in their ship buying program. Bored with pushing paper for the Navy, Casey noticed that a number of wealthy young men had found jobs in a secret organization that Donovan was running. He managed to wangle an interview with Donovan's recruiters, but they also weren't particularly impressed with this officer who didn't seem to have much military bearing. But they hired him. And they quickly realized that Casey was a whiz at administration, and from his Research Institute of America days, he could analyze big chunks of information and write clear intelligence reports. So they packed him off to the OSS's very important station at Grosvenor Square in London. This was to manage the flow of paperwork there. In short order, Casey had his hand in every major operation the station was running. He was kind of like a human tornado there. As one of the officers there said of him, you could not pay attention to Bill Casey. Donovan soon was impressed with this 31-year-old Navy lieutenant, and in December 1944, he made Casey his chief of secret intelligence for Europe and ordered him to infiltrate the OSS agents into the Third Reich. That was a daunting mission. Even though it was losing the war at this time, Nazi Germany was still one of the world's most tightly run police states. The average German citizen had up to 18 different basic identity documents on him that an OSS unit codenamed Bach, after the composer, had to figure out how to forge. So Casey, who eventually had 330 people working for him, really had to scramble. In the last 5 months of the war, he managed to parachute in more than 150 agents into Germany to radio back intelligence for the advancing Allied armies. His spies often had to improvise on the fly. For example, one two-man team, codenamed Chauffeur, enlisted the help of 2 French women forced to work in a Bavarian brothel. The women would entice military secrets from their Wehrmacht customers between the sheets, while one of the OSS agents hid in the closet with a flashlight taking notes. Now, I'm not making this up, folks. This really happened. Bill Colby, our next subject. He was born in 1920. He was an Army brat. His father, who rose to the rank of colonel, was something of a curmudgeon and not a particularly pleasant fellow to be around. Colby spent his early years moving from one duty station to the next, which was an education in itself. He wanted to follow his father's footsteps, be an Army officer, but he graduated from high school ahead of schedule at the age of 16, his yearbook nicknamed him the Brain, and he was too young to enter West Point. So he went to Princeton, like Dulles did, and was eventually commissioned an ROTC second lieutenant in August 1941 when he turned 21. Bill Colby liked to quote Napoleon's standing order to his men, which was march to the sound of the guns. But after Pearl Harbor, it seemed to Colby that he was marching in the opposite direction, farther and farther away from that sound. He was put in the artillery branch and stuck in desolate Fort Sill, Oklahoma, teaching students how to fire howitzers. One day he spotted a notice on a bulletin board that said the Army wanted volunteers for an airborne artillery unit, and he could sign up. Colby applied, but he worried that his poor eyesight, he wore glasses, might disqualify him. So he memorized the eye chart when the doctor wasn't in the room. Of course the doctor caught him. But he figured Colby's eyes were probably good enough to see the ground when he parachuted to it, so he passed him. Bad luck then struck once more. On his second jump at Fort Benning, Georgia, Colby broke his right ankle. By the time it healed and he finished what remained of his airborne training, he was stuck at a replacement pool at Camp McCall, North Carolina, desperate to get to the sound of those guns. In mid-October 1943, he spotted another note tacked on a bulletin board. This one from some strange organization he'd never heard of called the OSS, which said if you were a paratrooper and you spoke French, and Colby spoke French, and you were looking for adventure overseas, call this number. So Colby called that number. And by the end of the month, he was at the Congressional Country Club just outside of Washington here, which the OSS had taken over to train its spies and saboteurs. The secret organization he was training for, which was codenamed Jedburgh, had been put together by the British to drop 3-man commando teams into France just after D-Day to organize the French resistance. From the Congressional Country Club, Colby and the other OSS recruits were packed off for more guerrilla training to a remote camp at Maryland's Catoctin Mountains near the FDR's presidential retreat, which of course today is called Camp David. The next stop was Peterborough, just north of London, and a country estate called Milton Hall, where the British continued to train what became a multinational force of mainly British, French, and American commandos. This was even more rigorous guerrilla training, and there was somewhat of a culture clash between the British and the American commandos. For example, Colby and the other Americans had to learn the British way of parachuting. British commandos jumped out of planes at altitudes as low as 500 feet. That's pretty low. And at that low, and their parachutes didn't come with a spare. At that low altitude, you didn't have time to deploy a spare anyway. The instructors told the American students that if their chute didn't open, to bring it back and we'll give you a new one. The Americans, of course, didn't find that joke particularly funny. Finally, in August 1944, Colby's three-man team dropped into the Burgundy region southeast of Paris to organize French resistance attacks as Patton's Third Army came through. The secret war they fought turned out to be pretty complicated. Colby's team had to deal with an assortment of resistance factions that were poorly trained and equipped, where each faction seemed to be have a private political agenda, and they seemed to be fighting among themselves as much as they did the Germans. And Colby didn't know it at the time, but one of the resistance leaders he was working with, a man named Roger Bardet, was a traitor. He was secretly collaborating with the Germans. The Abwehr's top spy catcher in France, a guy named Hugo Bleicher, had recruited Bardet to betray his country. After the Third Army passed through Burgundy and Colby's Jedburgh assignment ended, he next led a Norwegian-American commando team that parachuted into frigid Norway in March 1945. Their mission, which was codenamed Ripe after a local bird that changed colors with the season, was to help keep some 300,000 German occupiers bottled up in Norway so they couldn't be transferred back to Germany to fight the Allied advance. This was a tough mission. Colby's men ended up fighting Norway's brutal winter weather as much as they did the Germans. Half of his 32-man force never made it to Norway because the planes carrying them couldn't find the drop zone in the snow, or they crashed, killing everyone on board. Colby's commandos did manage to blow up a bridge and destroy a section of railroad track in central Norway on the Nordland rail line, which carried German troops north to south. But the raids were risky and the skiing was absolutely exhausting. Colby's team, for example, nicknamed one mountain they had to ski over to escape a Nazi patrol, Benzedrine Hill, because practically all of them had to gulp down the stimulant pills for the artificial energy to get to the top. Finally, Richard Helms. He was born barely 2 weeks after Casey in 1913, but any similarity between the two boys ended there. Helms's grandfather, Gates McGarrah, was a famous international banker. His father was an Alcoa executive who, along with his mother, suffered bouts of depression. The family lived abroad, where Helms attended the pricey Les Rosés school in Switzerland and later the Real Gymnasium in Freiburg, Germany. It was a cosmopolitan education that Helms later thought was ideal for a spy. Back home, he became a big man on campus at Williams College, one of the little Ivies, with a Phi Beta Kappa key, and Harvard Law School open to him if he wanted it. But Helms instead chose journalism. He hoped to publish a newspaper one day. He signed on with the United Press and in 1935 became one of the news agency's correspondent in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler was wildly popular. His prized assignment came in September 1936 when he covered the annual Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg. After the rally, Hitler invited Helms and a half dozen other of the foreign correspondents to a, quote, light lunch in Nuremberg's castle. Helms was surprised, actually, how unremarkable the Fuhrer looked to him. The eyes that everybody claimed were hypnotic were actually a dull slate blue protruding from his eyes, and Helms thought they were quite ordinary. His pasty white face was tinged slightly pink. He had gold filled many of his teeth, and his knees rocked back and forth when he talked to the reporters, which Helms thought was kind of odd. But it was clear to Helms after his lunch with the dictator that Hitler was intent on going to war. After Pearl Harbor, Helms joined the Navy and was perfectly happy in the service's New York office plotting merchant ship movements to avoid German U-boat packs, when out of the blue, the OSS summoned him to its Washington headquarters in 1943. Turns out Donovan's agency had sent a request to the Navy for an officer who spoke French and German, who had lived overseas, and who had worked as a reporter. An IBM computer in the Navy's personnel office immediately spit out Helms's name. The next thing Helms knew, he was in a farmhouse in the countryside north of Baltimore for 2 weeks of spy training. He learned how to build a cover story to hide his identity, how to pick locks, how to burglarize offices, how to blackmail foreign officials, how to evade a shadowing by Gestapo agents, how to fight dirty with knives or pistols or the jagged edge of a whiskey bottle in a bar. Toward the end of his second week, as a field exercise, Helms was sent out with just $18 in his pocket to try to talk his way into a Pittsburgh steel plant and abscond with documents on the types of war goods it manufactured. The OSS called these training exercises schemes. His palms sweating, his stomach all knotted up, Helms managed to get into the plant, scoop up handfuls of paper on unattended desks, and slip out past inattentive guards. Now, 2 weeks wasn't enough to make Helms a proficient spy. He'd need a lot more training if he was going to be going out to the field. But it was enough for a staff job at the OSS's Washington headquarters on Navy Hill, which is right next to the State Department now, where he first served with a planning group dreaming up operations for overseas stations, and then worked on a bureau that coordinated intelligence gathering on Germany. He had other odd jobs as well. Donovan one time brought Charles de Gaulle's intelligence chief, who was this unsavory French colonel, to the United States for what amounted to a junket to butter him up. Because he spoke French and had been a newspaper man, Helms was assigned to the escort team for the colonel and his aides, with the very important mission of keeping the Frenchman's visit out of American newspapers. So for 3 weeks, a military plane flew the Frenchman, Helms, and the other escorts around the country to see the sights. So they had an expensive night out at Antoine's restaurant in New Orleans. In Hollywood, studio executives arranged for high-priced call girls to entertain the colonel and his aides in their hotel room. Helms was relieved that the visit never got into the papers. He finally made it to London in January 1945. He roomed with Casey, who lived like a slob, and he worked with him, keeping an eye on the Joe handlers. Spies the OSS sent out were called Joes, and an OSS handler was assigned to watch over them until they boarded the plane that took them to the drop zone. Helms would drive out to Harrington Field north of London with the handlers and their Joes, watch the planes take off with the spies, then he'd wait at the airport until the aircraft returned, and the pilot reported that the parachute drop had been successful. After Germany surrendered, Helms and Dulles moved into war-torn Berlin to set up a spy station there. It's hard for us to imagine today just how devastated, how chaotic, and how still violent the European theater was after Germany's surrender. The killing didn't stop after May 8, 1945. Berlin was like the Wild West when Helms arrived. Millions of homeless and starving souls filled the city. Billions of flies buzzed over thousands of rotting corpses in the rubble. Criminal gangs roamed the streets, many of them made up of tiny young orphans shaking down American GIs. And Soviet spies infested the western sectors the Americans, British, and French occupied. Helms and the station's other officers hunted for war criminals, tracked down artwork the Nazis had stolen, helped round up German scientists in an operation codenamed Paperclip, and even located the nurse from the Führer bunker near the Reich Chancellery, who he detailed for them Hitler's final days in the bunker. The target of Helms's spying soon shifted from the remnants of Nazi Germany to the Soviets who occupied East Berlin. And under highly classified orders from Donovan, Helms and the other operatives in the Berlin station also spied on the British and the French in their sectors. Donovan assumed that the British and the French were spying on the Americans, so he wanted to return the favor. Helms, Dulles, Colby, and Casey all returned home from the World War II, not emotionally scarred or drained by what they had experienced. You don't find any PTSD among these guys. Instead, they came back rather invigorated from their fight against Nazism and eager and ready for the next battle, which was against communism. World War II had a huge impact on their lives. Dulles ran the CIA much as he did the OSS station in Bern. The OSS taught Helms how to be a spy, and after the war he decided intelligence collection and not the newspaper business was his calling. Bill Colby, who wore his floppy fatigue cap from the war when he tended his garden, got a law degree when he returned, but he quickly grew bored with being a lawyer. He joined the CIA to fight communists as he had the Nazis for the OSS. When Bill Casey became CIA director, he hung 2 pictures in his Langley office, one of Ronald Reagan and the other a photo of his mentor, Bill Donovan. So I'll end it with that. Any questions or comments or anything else on your mind? Okay, yeah.
Thank you for a great presentation and detailing all those colorful personalities. It really, OFS really sounded like an old boys network, an old boys club. But I know that there are some women employed, especially one famous woman who became famous later, Julia Child, of course.
Right.
How common was it for women to work in OSS? I mean, she's pretty unusual anyway.
Mm-hmm.
She met her husband, of course. in
Right.
OSS.
Paul Childs.
Too. And how did the few women who worked there relate to this rather guys network?
Right.
Could you repeat the part of the question?
Yeah, it was a question about women in the OSS. You mentioned Julia Child is one of the most noteworthy examples. And how did they work and relate to the guys in the OSS? Actually, it wasn't a small number of women who were in the OSS. Donovan hired about 4,000 women for the OSS. It's interesting. Even though Donovan actually had a number of affairs over the years, he had a number of mistresses, he was still somewhat of a feminist in other respects. He paid the women at the OSS higher salaries than they could earn in any other federal agency. So they liked working there. Still, there was a glass ceiling in the organization. A few of them rose up past the ranks of the secretarial pool, or like Julia Childs, who was in morale operations, eventually stationed in Ceylon. Some of them became research analysts, although when they went over to the Pentagon, they were required to walk behind the director of research so as not to appear, equals to the guys there. Donovan himself used women an awful lot in the organization as spies and propagandists, although he was a tyrant to work for, at least among his secretaries. In fact, his secretaries, Donovan's code number in the OSS was 109, which just happened to be his room number in the headquarters building. Secretaries also gave him another code name. They called him Seabiscuit because he was like the racehorse. He always seemed to be running around and demanding. But he was, really overly demanding with his operatives. But they had women working not only in research but also as spies, saboteurs. Some of them worked with the French resistance, and they had casualties among the women too. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but the question that was just asked makes me make a comment. My mother
Right.
was one of those women.
Oh, really?
She
Oh,
worked
what's her
in-
name?
Marion Frieswick, and she
Okay.
and my father both worked in OSS.
Really?
My they both stayed to CIA. My father retired
Mhm.
from CIA after 40-some years.
Yeah.
But she was a research analyst. They were both cartographers by
Mhm.
training and were brought in to build the map division in OSS.
Right. Yeah, the map division was actually very, very important for the OSS because a lot of the places they were dropping, particularly the Allies, they didn't have valuable maps on. They used Michelin guides for the Torch invasion. So it was that was actually a very important division. But yeah, as I say, there were a lot of couples in the OSS.
They met there and married.
Yeah, and who went on to work in the CIA. How about that? Yeah.
Could you briefly explain what positions these four men had? I mean, how did they get to be director? What was their path?
Oh, okay. Yeah. How did these my four characters become CIA directors? How did they rise up? As I say, we'll start with Alan Dulles. He came back to the United States after the war had ended, after a short time in the Berlin station. Went back to Sullivan and Cromwell to the law firm. Was bored silly with it. Eventually joined what became the CIA as a deputy director under Bedell Smith, who had been Eisenhower's chief of staff and was the first CIA director. Then he rose up from there and became CIA director under Dwight Eisenhower. Donovan actually incidentally thought it was Donovan was lobbying for a CIA director under Eisenhower himself, and thought Dulles would be a lousy administrator and would screw up the agency. Ironically, Dulles also thought he could have run the OSS better than Donovan did. Let's see, Richard Helms came next. He came back from Berlin, the Berlin station, and went immediately into what were the successor organizations to the CIA, the Central Intelligence Division at one point, and at a very young age became the manager of clandestine operations for Europe and then really for the entire world. Rose up through the ranks quickly. Worked for Dulles when Dulles was CIA director, although Dulles always thought Helms was a good administrator but not a swashbuckler like Dulles wanted. In fact, a lot of people say that if Helms had been in charge of the covert branch that at the time of the CIA Bay of Pigs fiasco, that it would have never have occurred. Helms would have limited it in scope. Bill Colby came back, became a lawyer, worked in Donovan's law firm for a while, then came to Washington, worked at the National Labor Relations Board for a little bit, was bored silly with it, and eventually drifted into the CIA. In fact, his wife Barbara found out about that he moved to the CIA when one of I guess the people in their carpool noticed that Colby was always was walking in the opposite direction of the National Labor Relations Board to where the CIA was located. He rose up in the ranks, became really a star for the agency, particularly in its East Asia division. Went to Vietnam two times, fairly controversial then. Became linked or tarred by the some of the CIA operations in Vietnam, particularly the Phoenix program. And eventually, when Nixon fired Helms, this is during the Watergate scandal, Helms actually drew the line at one point on things he would not do for Nixon in the Watergate scandal. Nixon appointed Colby as CIA director because he thought he could manage him better. And then it turned out that Colby, later on, really to save the agency, opened up the what were called the Family Jewels Report on agency misdeeds to Congress. Bill Casey, when he came back from World War II, he really wanted to follow the same path from that Donovan had, which was he wanted to make his millions in New York on Wall Street, and then come back to Washington to get into national security, which is what basically Donovan did. So after he did make his millions, he first worked in Richard Nixon's campaign, ghost wrote a book for Nixon, and was noticed there, and then became Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, and Reagan credited him with being, I guess what you call, his Karl Rove, the architect who saved his campaign. Colby expected to be made Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense for getting Ronald Reagan elected. But Nancy Reagan was horrified at the notion of Colby, who was a real sloppy eater, being at diplomatic dinners. And Caspar Weinberger, who was a member of the California Mafia, the Inner Circle, had the Defense Department locked up. So Reagan offered Casey the CIA. And at first, Casey told him, well, I'll have to think about it. He was kind of insulted, which kind of surprised Reagan. He thought it was a pretty good job. Finally, some of the OSS veterans convinced Casey that it was a perfect job for him, particularly for, the hardline foreign policy that, he believed in and that Reagan was ushering in, the whole strategy of rolling back communism instead of containing it. So that real quick history is how those four guys got to where they did. Oh, yeah.
After studying William's life so extensively, I somewhat mysterious nature of his death,
Yeah,
which was highlighted in the documentary that his son created about
Carl Colby did. Right.
Commando running you, and he seemed to insinuate that it maybe was a suicide.
Right. The question is Colby's mysterious death, to talk about that and the different theories about what happened. Colby's was this was in Maryland at his lakeside country home there. Went out in a boat and drowned. His body was found later. This is after he left the CIA. And there have been all kinds of conspiracy theories that have been battered around that maybe the KGB, a hit team, got Colby and killed him, or that angry CIA officers who of hated Colby bumped him off. Carl Colby, who is one of Colby's sons, did a documentary where his theory was that Colby was distraught over his role in Vietnam, the Phoenix program, distraught over the death of his daughter, who died of anorexia, a very tragic case. I looked into all the investigative files and the autopsy and everything else, and what you find a lot of times in the spy business and everything, the most mundane explanation turns out to be the true one. In Colby's case, after a nice clam dinner and a bottle of wine, he went out, decided to take a row in his rowboat out in the lake, suffered a massive heart attack and a stroke, fell off out of the boat and drowned, and that was it. He was never distraught over Vietnam. He slept like a baby over Vietnam. He was proud of what he did there, and though he was sad about his daughter's death, he was not distraught, enough to take his life. Even so, I mean, the conspiracy theories, have lasted to this day, and I guess the most prominent one is that disgruntled CIA officers bumped him off. Actually, interestingly enough, Sally Shelton Colby, who was Bill Colby's second wife, told me she got, I think, phone calls from 10 people who said they were CIA officers after Colby died, who said they thought he got it coming to him, the accident and everything. So, anything here? Oh, well, thank you very. Oh, wait a minute. So one
more question.
One more question. Sorry.
Can you talk about the church committee and who responded to that? Is that Colby?
Yeah, that was Colby. The church committee and the Pike committee on the House side were the two committees set up to investigate the CIA abuses in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Colby, was CIA director then. He faced really a critical choice and and decided to release a huge batch of material, particularly the Family Jewels report, which is something like 700 pages long, of CIA misdeeds in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. There's been a lot of theories on why he did it. Some people thought he was an overgrown Boy Scout or a Jesuit going haywire and confessing too much, or that he had, there were other lofty other motives behind it. When I talked to Colby's son, one of whom's a lawyer, he confided into him exactly why he did it, and it was because he was a lawyer, and because in any court case, in a discovery case, I don't know if we have any lawyers in the group here, if a judge demands discovery and you don't produce everything that's demanded by the court for a particular trial or case, the judge will just order the marshals in to clear everything out of your organization. Well, Colby realized that in case of Congress, if he didn't turn over material to Congress, they would come in and just tear everything out of the agency and really disable it. And so this way he managed to really control what went to Capitol Hill and ended up saving the agency in the end. It could have been broken apart at that point. So,
Doug, I get the final question. Would you say a word about the role the Library of Congress played in the creation of the CIA.
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm glad you asked that. Actually, it played a very prominent role when Donovan first formed the agency. Like he said, he actually started from -0, which was the case. He only had one guy, and that was himself. He had to set up he knew he wanted to set up a research outfit. Eventually became known as the Research and Analysis branch of his agency. But initially he set it up here in the Library of Congress and used academics here that were associated with the Library of Congress. The most notable of which was Archibald MacLeish, who was the librarian of the Congress, right? Who helped Donovan set it up for him here in the library. And in fact, if you go to the manuscript division, and I went through Archibald MacLeish's papers, you can see all the memos and letters that he wrote to Donovan in that early period. Eventually, then they moved the research branch to Navy Hill, next to the State Department. But its start was here in the library.
Thank you. We'll take one more question.
Oh, sure.
Just a quick comment on that with family relationships. My great aunt's stepson was a guy named George Cackley who worked for the Legislative Reference Service.
George, what last name?
George Cackley.
Okay.
Grew up in Berryville, Virginia.
Yeah.
And he worked for the Legislative Reference Service, and he worked for Bill Donovan and later James Jesus Angleton at the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And to take the ironies even further, he was caretaker of Oak Hill Cemetery for a while, which is the same job as David Baldacci's protagonist.
Ooh, that makes a great conspiracy, doesn't it? I don't know what, but it makes a great conspiracy.
George Cackley was also, unbeknownst to me, I'd learned this in his obituary, he was a paratrooper during World War II, but he worked at the library prior to World War II, so there might be some OSS connection there.
Could be. Oh, that's fascinating.
We're a shady agency. You can see that. Join me in thanking Doug Waller for a wonderful talk. We're going to have a book signing out back. You can buy a copy of the book at the Library of Congress discount, get it signed, and I just want to comment. I can see the reporter in you and the journalist in you. You really did a terrific job in presenting everybody's story and kept it moving. It was great fun. One more round of applause for Doug.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.